right, hi everybody. We're just getting started here with our Binge the Bible breakdown. Welcome everybody. We're just making sure our feeds are going here and that you are with us. It looks like you are on Facebook and you checked YouTube.
We're getting there.
We do all our own stunts here. All the production.
That's what we're calling it.
Yes. So if you're looking for Binge the Bible, you are in the right place. So welcome. Well, as I said, welcome everybody. This is the Binge the Bible breakdown where we are working through the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, in 6 weeks. And this is week number 3. So we're glad that you're with us as we start diving into some wisdom literature. But first, let's introduce ourselves. I'm Pastor Nathan, pastor here at Elk River Lutheran.
And Jeremy Hallquist, intern pastor.
Yes. And so as I said, we're binging the Bible and working our way through these different sections of books of the Bible. And so we started with the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Then we got into the historical books, these books that tell this long kind of history. And now we're getting into wisdom literature, which is kind of an interesting collection of books, which are collections of readings and poetry and stories and proverbs, little wisdom pieces. And so we've got an image here that we will put up that I think kind of lists the books at least. So you see, this is the sections of the books that we're talking about, and we'll get to the questions in a minute. I think what I want to kind of start with, what sets this section of the Bible apart from really the whole rest of the Bible, is where most of the Bible is written to be read kind of all as one. Like that's the case with the Pentateuch and with these other books of the Bible, where it's like you're meant to start at the beginning and kind of read through the end. It's this one big sweeping story. This section of wisdom literature is almost all collections, with one exception, Job, which we'll get to as a weird exception to a lot of the Bible, but it is one big story. But when you look at the others, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, those are all these kind of collections of poetry and different ideas, kind of little nuggets of wisdom that have been put together. And so they come to us as single books, but are really collections. They're mixtapes, if you were making mixtapes, or collections of literature. It's the encyclopedia versus like a book about one subject, right?
Right, and it's thinking about multiple authors and multiple time frames. So this isn't someone sat down in a room and said, oh, here's what we need to write, but there's just kind of this variety of story and people that make up these books.
Yeah, and so that makes them seem a little odd because they don't like they all are written differently or sound differently, take on a variety of subjects, but that's part of their richness too, is they are taking on a variety of topics and really embracing kind of human life. And so I think in the introduction that will be in the Bible, or in the bulletin this weekend, you said this, that these books probe deeply into the questions of evil and suffering, love, and the human. And so this little image that we threw up has these different kinds of themes and questions laid out. I don't know if we want to really dig into those as one, or we just kind of encourage you. You can kind of look at that. If you want to really spend some time with it, you can pause.
Yeah, I think one of the things to note about that image is this kind of general theme. Think about this as like an umbrella approach. It does a lot of good if you take it as a whole picture, but it kind of misses some of the nuances within it. That's one of the limits of graphics, of course.
Yeah.
But I think these questions then kind of probe deeper into our human story, our human emotion, and kind of this interplay with both our people we agree with or don't agree with, or our questions about God. I mean, these things kind of wrestle with this kind of inner longing for relationship that comes out of these books of wisdom.
Yeah.
And so I think it's good to have a good starting point, have a good place to go, oh, what's really going on? Otherwise, even books like Job will feel like, oh, this is doom and gloom and the end of the world. If you don't kind of get that big picture, you might kind of wrestle with this, well, what's this all about? Or why does this not make sense?
Yeah. So we're going to dive in and we're going to have some fun with some sections and books of these Bibles, but we're going to start with Job, which fun is not probably the word I would describe. Used to describe the book of Job. It's a lot of things. fun? Not really.
Right.
So, yeah, so the story of Job is this story of the Bible. Like I said, this is the only book in this section that really, truly reads front to back, like beginning to end. It has a narrative and it is a story. And so I think people in history have kind of wondered and questioned, like, is this a true story? Well, yeah, I think it's true. But then people ask, well, is this factual, or was this written as a parable to kind of help explore the issues of suffering and, good thing or bad things happening to good people? And so I think there's, biblical scholars who, raise those questions and wonder. But I think regardless of whether is read as a newspaper accounting or a parable, there's some deep truths in this, and it really gets at some big life questions.
Right, and I think one of the kind of leading us into conversation is this idea of like karmic justice. I mean, we talk about karma a lot. That, if you do bad things eventually will catch up with you at some point. Job is kind of the polar opposite of this karmic notion, really saying, Job doesn't deserve what happens to Job. By all accounts, God brags about him in the first chapter. I mean, this is kind of an upright, upstanding gentleman, doing everything by the book, worshiping God, kind of following all these protocols, and yet is subjected to this kind of manipulative suffering that happens. It's this interplay between God and Satan, and these conversations about who deserves this. Satan really saying, if bad things happen to people, they're going to curse God's name. And Job is kind of completely counterpoint to that. Yeah,
because essentially, to set the stage for the story, I mean, God and Satan are just hanging out and make a bet, right? I mean, Satan says, I bet I can turn a really faithful person unfaithful by making bad things happen. And God says, no, I don't think so. I'll take that bet. And then poor Job is the subject of the bet. And so all this torment from Satan, and he loses everything by the end, and in an attempt for Satan and God to just have this kind of little bet. And that's where it's a weird story.
Yeah, and trying to make sense of this meaning, and what is God up to? What does it say about the character of God versus even Job's character? I think there's this kind of unique bounce around of what is deserving, or what is justice, what is God in this story. And I think it's a good question for us to kind of wrestle with as we think about, what is God's role in suffering? What is God's role in kind of bad things and good things? And really, how do we make sense and meaning of that as people of God?
Yeah, because I think, you can disagree with this if you don't agree with it, but I think one of the main themes in Job is Job's continued faithfulness and trust in God, right? I mean, that's ultimately what he comes back to. Every time something bad happens, he doesn't spend a lot of time trying to figure out who he should blame for it. He just kind of continues to trust that, okay, life can get better, God is still God, and it'll be okay.
Right.
He doesn't celebrate that life is great, because it's not, but there's a faithfulness that isn't grounded in life being perfect, but a faithfulness grounded in God being God, and God will continue to provide and sustain and help Job even when the things are looking down.
Right, and the element of trust, right? Job has to balance this, what's happening to him, with saying God is who God is, and some of that I have to live with whatever may come of the world. And there's this kind of interesting interplay. I love the friends. With friends like these, who needs enemies? This is kind of a great way to think about these stories, is they're trying to balance God's action as, well, you did something wrong, you deserve this punishment. And Job keeps kind of reframing this and saying, well, no, I didn't. There's nothing I did that warranted this action. And even so, like this idea of justice, Elihu, the fourth friend in this story, if Job is innocent, it's a completely untrue statement according to Elihu, because no one can be innocent before God.
Sure.
So it kind of plays with this sense that we're guilty by just being human. And so it is God's love and God's mercy that kind of moves us into this story.
Right.
And so there's this interesting kind of friendship and play that happens in that.
Yeah, and ultimately, a lot of bad things happen, but spoiler alert, it ends with kind of Job's life being restored.
Right.
Because, God has won the bet, Job remains faithful, and so it's restored.
Yeah. One thing to note, too, is that Job, God's interaction is not an answer to the story.
Sure.
God doesn't say, well, here's why.
Yep.
Instead, God kind of points Job to more questions. Were you there when the world was created to know how that your life is a part of this bigger story of creation? And I think it begins to kind of help us wrestle with, maybe I'm just a piece in part of this huge puzzle of life, instead of being the centerpiece of that huge puzzle of life.
Right. Because I think that's one of the big takeaways of Job is that there are no easy answers given for these big questions of, why do good things happen to bad people? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do bad things happen, period? Like, all of those things, there aren't neat and clean answers given. And I mean, I don't know about you, that's pretty accurate to my experience of life too, whereas I wish it was maybe different, but that's kind of what I've experienced too, and this wrestles with that.
Right. And even, the end result of Job's restoration, he's given a wife and children, not his wife and children.
Sure.
So it's not a full restoration.
Yeah.
Job still has to live with the suffering and pain and the reality of life, but he's also confronted with this hopeful promise that God is still in this.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a challenging book to read.
Yeah.
It's important to note, too, this is one of the older books in the Old Testament.
Sure.
So as you're thinking about this, how this all interplays with the rest of Scripture, it really kind of probes at these wonderings and questions that people are having.
Yep.
And so continue to think about that as that kind of larger question. So we don't get an answer at the end of Job. We're kind of left with our questions and wonderings.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of accurate to what we see through this whole wisdom literature section of the Bible is they wrestle with big questions, all of these books and authors and everything, and there aren't neat and clean answers given.
Right.
Like and that's when you're wrestling with the big questions of life. That's kind of what you get is not always neat and clean answers. Yeah. And so the next section, unless you have anything more for Job, Job. If you want to read Job, I mean, it is one of the more readable books of the Old Testament as far as it does carry through, but it does ask these big questions. It's a readable story, but it's a heavy story, right. And so it's one to definitely check out. Also very readable are the Psalms. That's a book of the Bible that is probably most visited in worship contexts. So much music and many worship services have either readings of Psalms or singing of Psalms in them. Bible camp, where we're headed this weekend, is full of songs about Psalms, sung Psalms, and so as we enter these book of Psalms, I'm guessing everyone comes with some kind of knowledge and understanding that Psalms are these kind of poetically written songs, sometimes sung, sometimes spoken, sometimes read responsively in worships, and probably somewhat familiar with some Psalms. So I'd be curious, if you're watching with us, drop in the comments, what is your favorite Psalm? Do you have a favorite Psalm? There's 150 to choose from. They're on all kinds of themes. Some are happy, some are really laments and sad, and some are challenging, and some are just kind of odd. There's all kinds of Psalms, 150 of them. And so what's your favorite one? And maybe I'll ask you that. That wasn't in the notes, but I'll put you on the spot. Do you have a favorite Psalm?
Yeah, for me, Psalm 121 will always kind of be a grounding psalm for me.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that I lift my eyes to the heavens. Where does my help come from? This notion that we sort of wonder aloud where God is in our story.
Yeah.
And being able to sit with this notion that God kind of enters in, not letting God doesn't slumber or sleep on our stories, but moves within our stories. And I absolutely love that. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
How about yours?
Yeah, I think of Psalm 121 a lot too. It's one that I really, really like. Another one that I like too, that I often think of it being sung by U2, and then we sang at the camp I worked at, is Psalm 40, which has these lines: "I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined and heard my cry. And it's a psalm of, it's not necessarily a lament, I don't think, but it is a psalm about like waiting for God and experiencing God.
Right.
Even in the miry pit is the language that's used. Like, so when you're down, God being there. And again, I think of Bono singing it over and over again and stuff. But it's Psalm 40. So there's a musical version. You can check it out, Psalm 40.
Yeah.
It's just called 40, the song by U2. But it's a great sung version of the Psalms.
Sure.
And there's a lot of sung versions of Psalms out there,
Right.
and that's a favorite of mine. So
Yeah, I think, as you're commenting, we'd love to hear those even as we look back later on. If you're watching this later, still leave us a comment.
yeah, absolutely.
But I think, it's important to note there's kind of four types because you hinted and alluded.
Yep.
Psalms of praise, Psalms of cry for help. Oh, Lord, where are you? How long will you forsake me? Those types of things. This Psalms of lament, this sort of breaking of the human heart before God and saying, God, why have you abandoned us? It's kind of probing at this human question. And then this idea of trust, that trust becomes the center of this usually kind of questioning God and then turning to the sense of, but you promised and you are still there. This kind of shift in conversation. I think that's a great way to kind of think about them. So as you're thinking about that human story, where kind of those Psalms all compile together.
Yeah, and when we think about the authorship of the Psalms, there's King David, who we talked about just last week because he shows up in those historical books, his story. David is credited to have written many of the Psalms. So when you're reading in a Bible, often underneath the Psalm number, it'll maybe have a title, and then it'll say a Psalm of David or a Psalm of so-and-so, a Psalm from the assembly. Because, of course, the Book of Psalms was written not as a book of Psalms, but all these kind of individual songs and poetry that were used in worship, and then ultimately kind of gathered all together. And so you have pieces written by a lot of different people over a lot of different years, collected into these and kind of boiled down to these 150 that we know as the Psalms. So that's where you get all these different themes and voices coming through in the Psalms.
Right. I think it's kind of interesting as you're thinking about, when we think about pastoral care or you think about visiting someone in the hospital, that's almost always the go-to source.
Yeah.
Because the Psalms really sort of name our story.
Yeah.
I mean, they begin to encapsulate our experience in ways that are just these powerful testaments of God showing up.
You bet.
Yeah.
We last year when we did the whole thing on David, did a whole series on Psalms. So if you want to go back and dive deep into Psalms in those sections, those different categories, in that talk we did a lot of that. We're breaking down into the different categories of Psalms because David wrote so many of them. So when we were talking about David, we did a lot on that. And so there's a lot of information out there that breaks down those different categories, but ultimately the Psalms also are just really readable. And so you can work your way through the Psalms. There's 150 of them, so it'll take a while, but you'll be blessed just reading 1 to 150, I think. So yeah,
I think that's a great way to kind of intro yourself to the Psalms.
Yeah. Well, a book of the Bible that we do not hear of much in worship, that there aren't a lot of songs written based on, is the Book of Proverbs. And the reason I think why we don't ever hear Proverbs, at least not ever, but at least not very often in worship, is because they are Proverbs. They're like primarily these single verses that don't flow. And so within our scriptural and worship tradition, we often read a scripture reading or a few scripture readings that are a passage. And so the Proverbs aren't really necessarily read or written to read like 10 in a row, or like they're meant to like, here's a chunk of wisdom, a chunk of knowledge, and stew on this for a while, let it ruminate a little bit, and so it doesn't really fit into our tradition in worship, right? And yet, boy, are there some golden nuggets of wisdom in there, right? There's some really funny, weird, playful advice, and then some really deep and profound wisdom too. So yeah, what do you think about Proverbs?
Well, the two things I would point out is, one, we kind of attribute a significant portion of them to King Solomon. So Solomon, the wise king, the one who divides the baby in half to find the real mother, that kind of wise Solomon. So think about that as kind of a framework and where it might fit into the scriptural context. The other thing I would point out is wisdom is feminine in Proverbs. And so thinking about this female voice, if you're a lady, you may read it very differently because it kind of negatively portrays women for a good chunks of Proverbs. Mm-hmm. But thinking about it in terms of the power and voice of females, and who we should really sort of take our wisdom from. So there's this kind of interplay both in human experience as well as kind of this image of relationship that comes with wisdom. And so if you leave wisdom unattended, eventually we fail to learn, we fail to grow. And so thinking about that as a part of our human story that goes with it.
Wisdom is feminine in Greek too, so that carries into the New Testament. And the Greek word is Sophia. So if you ever know anyone named Sophia, that's the Greek word for wisdom. And maybe there's something to that wisdom is female, and maybe men shouldn't be making all the decisions and claiming all the power. So maybe there's something there, right? I think we could all learn from that. And so we had pulled up some of just our favorite Proverbs. I got a little bit of list here that I think.
Should we say the one that kind of centers the entire book first? Maybe that might be
Let's
helpful.
go there last. I think let's show the silly ones first and then actually get at, okay, what's this all about?
Sure.
I think that works.
Yeah.
Because I want to share some of this great wisdom that's here. And so these are a kind of a list here that's actually, like you had said, this is the Message translation. And so these will read a little different depending on what translation of the Bible you have. But I think there's some of these that are just so funny, but also kind of profound too. So maybe we can just share some. I don't know if you have some of these too. Okay. If you don't have oxen, at least your barn is clean. So there you go. Like that's looking on the bright side of life.
Yeah. This is one that, for whatever it's worth, I find funny. Come, let us belly up to the bar and drink love all night. Let's enjoy all the delights of caressing each other. Full disclosure, I'm married, but he's not home.
There you go. Okay.
And then and then it gets into this whole thing about, a fool runs into not only the situation but also the husband.
Sure.
So don't go there.
Yeah. Here's one from Proverbs Chapter 26, verse 11. It's kind of gross, but I think it's really funny and kind of profound. A dog returns to its vomit like a fool does wrong again. And I just think it's a really graphic image, but I mean, pretty profound. Like, we continue to do wrong over and over again and repeat mistakes over and over. And the image of it being like a dog returning to a pile of its own vomit is pretty funny, I think. Because, like, if it wasn't good the first time, dog, maybe you shouldn't eat it again. We can say that dog's kind of foolish, but how often are we the foolish dog, repeating the same mistakes?
Right. Don't retaliate and say, I'm going to even the score. Wait for the Lord. He packs a bigger punch.
Yes. It's better to eat vegetables in a house filled with love than to eat steak served by someone who hates you. Yeah. Now, of course, in biblical tradition and kind of ancient times, to eat meat is the best thing. So vegetarians are also like always the butt of a joke. Like if you're eating vegetables in ancient times, like you're poor and foolish. Basically, is like which is always kind of funny for framing for vegetarians today.
Right. Or this one I love too. Even a fool looks smart with his mouth shut. If he doesn't say anything, he could actually look intelligent.
Yeah, right?
Right. So sometimes it's better to keep your mouth closed and see where you end up.
Yes. And some of these, I think we really get into this in Song of Solomon, where it's like a little dated, but I think you can still get some of the points. A horse needs a whip and a donkey needs a bridle, but a jackass needs a kick in the butt. The word of the Lord, y'all.
There you go.
I mean, there's so much. I don't know. Do you have another one or any more that you really want to get into?
No, I think the idea is that we confront the realities, but also it's about there's proverbs in there about lying tongues and keeping your word, I mean, it's really you have to kind of wrestle with these things in terms of how do we weigh our human story against it.
Yeah. Before we started, you shared that one of the places and times you've used the Book of Proverbs is in men's canoe trips to the Boundary Waters, and I love that idea of sitting around a fire, because I think, and reading through these, because I think these really are like, it's hard to use them in the worship context, because it's like you have to, like, you can't just read like 6 of them and then try to preach a sermon on 6, because they're so different. Like, they're not always connected. They're kind of these standalone, like, one minute you're talking about dog vomit, and then the next you're talking about, like, gossip behind someone's back. Like, I mean, they're big issues, and they're not always real connected. And yet, when you can go through verse by verse and say, oh boy, what do you think about this one? Oh man, how about this one? I mean, I'm sure that those are profound conversations and fun.
Right. And you laugh, and you also go, oh, that hurt. Like, you're confronted with your stuff. And I think that's one of the beauties of those the Proverbs as a whole.
Yeah. And so I think with that kind of framing, I think it would be to share this one that kind of holds together, like, why are all of these random bits and pieces of advice even in the Bible, right? Why does the Book of Proverbs exist, and this whole section of the Bible exist?
Right. And I think that's that, if you wanted like a core verse to hang your hat on in Proverbs, starts at 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. The sense of, like, where does it all begin kind of begins with God's conversation. That as we learn to live in relationship, we also have this element of fear and learning. I think I want to tie those words together. But our sense of how we grow as people starts in our root foundation is with God.
Yeah.
And so thinking about that, all of these things that are both funny and lighthearted also really play into the rest of these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the notion that kind of carries through certainly the whole book of Proverbs, but even this whole section of kind of wisdom literature, is that God has baked deep wisdom and knowledge into this world, and we ought to be exploring it and wrestling with it as people, not just as a faith practice, yes, but I mean, this is everyday applied faith. This isn't just head knowledge, but it's heart and soul, whole body knowledge.
Right, and really thinking about it in terms of beginning to sit at the feet of wisdom leads to a long and happy life. And you'll discover that sort of notion of how do I continue to figure out relationship throughout this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So check out the Proverbs. Yeah, the Proverbs is another book, because of the way it's written, kind of like the Psalms. You can read cover to cover, or you can just flip verse to verse practically, certainly chapter to chapter, but even verse to verse, and you will find some really weird and really profound things in the Book of Proverbs. That's how's that for an endorsement? Find some weird and profound things in the Book of Proverbs. But that's it.
Weird things throughout the entirety of Scripture that contextually don't make sense for us now.
But. True that. Yeah, and we'll get more of that in Song of Solomon, I think. But the next section, the next book of the Bible we're looking at is Ecclesiastes, and this is where, if I wasn't worried about getting copyright infringement issues, I'd start playing Turn, Turn, Turn by the Byrds, that classic, for everything there is a season and a time, and it'd be really sweet. But again, copyright issues being what they were, we'll just let you imagine that song playing in your head as we enter the book of Ecclesiastes, which kind of an interesting book of the Bible, because it does ask kind of the question, like, what's the point of life, but almost asks it as a hypothetical and a shrug of the shoulders, like, what's the point of life? Like not actually looking to answer it, but just to kind of be like, almost kind of wrestle with, like, it feels like life is pointless.
Right. Yeah, and this is, so thinking about the sort of character development, this is a good one for thinking about this person. Sure. Who has everything, is blessed by everything, is still, made every trip around the sun and found joy in all of the things they have acquired, and still says, well, it's all vanity, or vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Yeah. I mean, it's this sort of lamenting, everything is meaningless, and having everything doesn't make life better.
Right.
And this struggle as a human to figure out, what do I do with it when I have everything and it still doesn't feel valued?
Yeah.
And Ecclesiastes really kind of flips the script on Job and Proverbs, from losing and having and gaining and all of these sort of things to more of a sense of what they're called to be.
Right. Yeah, and so like you get that in this chapter 3, this everything has a time. You get this beautiful poetic language about, for everything there's a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up. And it goes through, it's just this beautiful kind of poetic language, but then it kind of gets to it, to say, but what gain have the workers for their toil? I've seen the business that God gives everyone to be busy with. He's made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, there's a sense of past and future. I know there's nothing to be happy, enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it's God's gift that we should eat, drink, and take pleasure in their toil. But ultimately at the end, it's like, but what's the point? Ultimately, right. That's it. That's right. All there is, it seems.
Yeah, chasing these things is like chasing after the wind or a vapor of breath that just sort of flutters away. It is this really interesting perspective.
Yeah, and so if you read Ecclesiastes, there's these really beautiful kind of parts to hold on to, and then there's this still kind of like, but what's the point? And, I suppose, someone might say, well, obviously in our tradition of faith that there is something bigger than just this life, but then also, you can even say it, a part of the adventure is the journey itself, and you get hints of that all through Ecclesiastes, that, of course there's meaning. Like, even as he's asking, what's the point of all this? Just being with family and friends and experiencing the love of community, what's the point of any of this? It's like, well, that seems to be some pretty good points there.
Right, and even to think about, the author kind of comes to the conclusion that this moment, what I've been given, is what I'm called to enjoy.
Yeah.
Essentially, right here, right now, whatever I'm sitting in is the place that I'm called to be.
Yeah.
And it doesn't get much better if I keep pushing beyond that, and it doesn't get much better if I think about the past all the time.
Yeah.
But rather take in this moment, eat, drink, and be merry kind of a approach.
Yeah, that there is value and deep significance in the here and the now, and that's to be enjoyed.
Right. I would liken the kind of end result of this as kind of walking out and seeing the sunset.
Sure.
It steals your breath. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous, but it's fleeting. And thinking about that sense of like an experience that just sort of ultimately goes away. And it can either kind of live in that moment, or I can be so distracted and doing everything else that I miss the opportunity.
Yeah.
And really thinking about that is this idea of purpose and season in the moment that we're called to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One other section I'd love to share here too that I think is, again, it kind of gets at this wisdom, and it's a part of Ecclesiastes that's maybe a little better known, and I think even I like to frame it in that whole kind of meaningless, pointless life thing, that it's like, well, actually what's being highlighted here doesn't seem so meaningless and pointless, and it's from Ecclesiastes Chapter 4. This is often a section that gets read at weddings. I've read it at weddings a lot myself, and it's the value of a friend. And so, like I say, a lot of times it gets read in the context of a wedding, but it's really talking about relationships in general. And so I'm just going to read a few verses here and let them kind of soak, because I think there's some good wisdom here. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good return for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift the other. But woe to the one who is alone and falls and does not have another to help. Again, if 2 lie down, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though one might prevail against another, 2 will withstand one. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. I think maybe there's some wisdom in that when life seems challenging or questionable or pointless, there is great comfort and support in community. That if that's what you're feeling is a sense of hopelessness and helplessness, it's not necessarily a time to push away from everyone, but a time to find that community and search out others to dwell with you, because that's where there's strength.
Right. Yeah, and the again, that sort of root foundation of where's God in the middle of those relationships and where they intersect.
Yeah.
I think that becomes an important part of this factor too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always kind of, when I'm talking about this in the context of weddings, that last verse, verse 12, makes this weird turn where it says it's all about, two people, working together, and then it ends with this cord of 3 strands, a threefold cord. And it's like, well, what's that other? We always kind of think about it as that third strand being God. That God is this force that brings us together as community. And so you can go check it out. It's Ecclesiastes 4, starting with verse 9, and you'll notice where it's like 2, 2, 2, and then randomly 3. And I think the assumption, the what I always read into is that that's this presence of God holding us together.
Mm-hmm.
I like it.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm thinking, okay, we're still here. My device dropped, so
all right.
I got nervous for a moment there.
Well, are you ready for a little romance in your life? You had a wedding anniversary this week, and so you maybe shared some of these beautiful poetic words with Ellie this week.
Yeah, no, I'm not that talented.
So the Song of Solomon is also accredited to King Solomon, like many of the Proverbs are, and it is a book of ultimately kind of love poetry primarily. And this is a book that a lot of the love poetry has not held up as well as other parts of the Bible that talk about faith and life. And so I thought I'd just share a few verses that I think are some of my favorites from this that really get at, it is love poetry, but maybe don't use these as pickup lines here still today, right? So this is I'm just going to read a couple verses from chapter 4. How beautiful you are, my love, how very beautiful. This is a good start. Your eyes are doves behind your veil. Choice. Still pretty good.
Smart, yeah.
Your hair is like a flock of goats moving down the slopes of Gilead. Okay, we're kind of veering off a little bit. I don't know if this is holding up. Your hair is like goats. Your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes that have come up from the washing, all of which bear twins. Not one of them is alone. So, you get it. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep, nice white sheep. Not one of them is alone, right? Like you don't have one single tooth just hanging out there. You got a whole flock of teeth, all nice and white. And there's also some sections that are a little dicey and would make me blush a little bit to read because it gets pretty graphic in some parts. But I think then again, oh my gosh, no, maybe I'll stop there. I'll stop there with the flock of sheep that are like a mouthful of teeth, because it really does. I can skip ahead even chapters, but it some of these come back, and this is like in chapter 6 it repeats these again, like all these nice compliments. But and your hair is like goats, your teeth are like sheep, your cheeks are like pomegranates,
Right.
You are tall and slender like a palm tree. There are compliments that are seemingly nice, and then others that are, in these days, we would hear them and say, I don't think that's great.
You're not probably going to find a lot of Song of Solomon on a greeting card.
No, unless it's a kind of weird little greeting card.
Right.
But it really does. I think what is present in the Song of Solomon is a celebration of human love and intimacy. Both kind of that's expressed in poetry, but also just physical touch and and a real physical intimacy too, which is not always present through the Bible, and I think sets Song of Solomon apart in that sense that this human love and intimacy is celebrated and lifted up as an important and beautiful thing created by God.
Right. And it names that in a way that sort of personalizes Scripture and our connection to each other.
Yeah.
That it's not just the sort of Pauline approach where love and intimacy is kind of relegated to private life, but it
Right.
is something that is sort of a public expression of love and affection for each other.
Yeah, I mean, it is all PDA, right? Public displays of affection on,
Right.
on display here in the Song of Solomon, and so I think it's good that this is in the Bible. I mean, we can kind of laugh at some of the different like imagery that's used because it seems so dated, but in its time, this was pretty juicy stuff, but also like beautiful. I mean, this is human love at its best, and is to be celebrated, and it's in the Bible still today. So I think we should honor and celebrate that as well.
Yeah, I think there's conversation in question too. Why is this in Scripture as a whole? I think it's important to note that some people read this as allegory to
Sure.
Christ's relationship with the church, Christ's relationship with us. And so there are these components as you read sort of this intimacy of relationship being the way that God responds to us and God responds to the world.
Yeah.
And so it's got some kind of unique roots and debate and all this stuff that goes alongside of it, besides the juiciness as you're putting it.
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
But I think it's kind of important to think about all of those images. It is also one of the pieces of Scripture that really references Old Testament, from walking in the garden with your lover.
Yeah.
Adam and Eve. Like these kind of
Yeah.
images portray and pull through from Old Testament all the way through this entire book.
Yeah.
And almost all of them really talk about how God's kind of relational component is still a part of what we're doing today.
Right. Yeah. You kind of, to really get the depth of it, you do have to kind of know the biblical story. Even at this page I'm looking at, it's talking about Pharaoh's chariots. It's talking about, the cedars of Lebanon. It's talking about I am the rose of Sharon. Like there's all these kind of allusions to different elements and sections of the Bible that are just baked into it.
Right. And it's connecting our love between people, between the love and God's story, and that we're not devoid of God's past as people, but we're also very deeply connected to that as we live in relationship with each other.
Yeah. And so I think I highly recommend checking out Song of Solomon for some interesting reading. I mean, both kind of like funny, kind of like, oh, well, that's kind of funny that's in the Bible, but also just like there's some really neat. I feel like every time I read through it, I'm like, wow, this is so good, and then it's like, whoa, this is weird, where it's like, wow, this is really beautiful poetry comparing you to your eyes to doves, which are beautiful, and then it's randomly in your hair, it's like goats, and your neck is like a gazelle. I'm like, is this a good thing or a bad thing? But but ultimately, there is really beautiful poetry about nature and creation is present in here in beautiful ways too. So.
Yeah, it's a good read. It makes an interesting read when you begin to kind of think about the biblical story with it. Mm-hmm. I never really thought about the depth of relationship from, the cedars of Lebanon, like this kind of obscure thing.
Yeah.
But those are the cedars in building the temple. Like this is all kind of the importance and value of God's story.
Yeah. And so I think this whole section of the Bible, this wisdom literature, is probably the easiest to jump around in. When we get to the letters of Paul in the New Testament, those likewise are also, bits and pieces you can jump in and out and find some wisdom sprinkled throughout, and that's definitely the case with the wisdom literature. Job is a big long read that you maybe read cover to cover, but these other books, like, you can really jump in and out and find really great pieces.
Yeah, and knowing, because you guys are all experts in biblical history, that last 2 weeks, knowing that what we're reading now in wisdom really is smattered throughout these experiences of Old Testament, King Solomon and all of these experiences really sort of harken back to what we just learned.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Bible is not just written from, chronologically. We start with Genesis and it ends in Revelation, but it's written all throughout these histories and gets clumped together, primarily working from an oral tradition to a written tradition, and then finally put together in these books that we have published here today. And so it's a long process and pulling pieces together, and there's a lot of good stuff in the wisdom literature. So check it out.
And by the end of it, you'll be so much wiser.
I know. And so I invite you to join us for worship on Sunday. We have a guest preacher who's going to be doing a little teaching and preaching on this, Justin Lind Ayers. Great pastor. I think you'll really appreciate what he has to say. Neat guy. I'm excited for him to be here. And in the bulletin, we'll have a little guide printed that covers some of the stuff we talked about here, and as well as has some readings, recommendations for additional reading, and so you can check that out on Sunday, either in person here at the church or online. And we will see you all for the Bible Breakdown again next Thursday. So see you then, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Have a good one.